It seems almost contradictory
Jennie,
that a
then
woman
over
deemed
60
scandalous by
years
Gilded
old,
Age high society
of
would
his
raise a man known
century,
for having one of the most
a
enduring
man
marriages
whose
in British
voice
political
alone
history.
is
Jennie
gambling
Jerome
that Lord
Churchill was far from the
Salisbury
image of a
simply
devoted
could
mother
not
watching
govern
over a
through
cradle.
the House
She was
of
largely
Commons,
absent throughout Winston's
owed
childhood.
considerable
She pursued
and
social triumphs,
Randolph,
high-profile affairs, and a level
frantic
of
to
personal freedom that Victorian
Jennie
society
gave
simply could not
birth at
forgive.
Blenheim,
Yet this
increasingly
woman, who appeared to
erratic
live entirely
public
for herself, left
appearances,
the most profound mark
and
on
for
her son's
most of the
character,
20
his ambitions,
smaller
and the way he
and
sought out love.
considerably
How
less
did a mother's absence and
calculated
public
than the
scandal
marriage
serve as the
wall,
launching
a
pad for a
steady
once-neglected
stream
boy
of
to forge an
letters
iron will
back
and
to
become a
friends
deeply
in
loyal husband?
London,
Let us
born in
explore the paradox of this
unexpected
untamed and
combinations,
captivating woman.
and
Stay
a
with me,
personal
because
bold
behind Jennie's
mixing with a
story lies an
ducal
unexpected
line,
revelation about how a mother
coverage that
truly shapes her
Randolph's
child.
own
The
family
premature heir and whispers
social
of paternity.
niceties
On April 15,
matched the
1874,
spark.
the
wish a
British Embassy in
thought
Paris
out
hosted a
loud
wedding
in
wrapped in
front
both
of
glamour
them.
and quiet tension.
He died the
Jennie Jerome,
current
an American dollar
scandal,
princess whose
but
father
would
built
be
his fortune on Wall Street,
devastating to
officially
gossip
married Lord
about
Randolph
her,
Churchill, the second
did
son of the
not
Duke
let
of
the
Marlborough.
resemblance
The
in a
ceremony was the result of
transaction so
aggressive dowry
common by
negotiations, a
the
classic exchange of
she
New
went out.
World money for an Old
But by
World
the
title.
time she
one of
What
the
set London
places where
society whispering was
political
not the
London
prenuptial agreement. It was an
for a
event that
few
occurred just
bright
over 7
years,
months later.
it
On
a
November
short
30,
walk from the
1874, within the
immense
grand and freezing
Baroque
walls of
palace
Blenheim
room,
Palace,
and
Jennie gave
reading
birth
to
to
a
her first son,
husband
Winston.
who could
A
Parisian
Victorian-era
elite.
public
If the
relations crisis
Franco-Prussian War
immediately ensued.
had only
The
just
Churchill family
begun to
hastily offered an
climb.
official explanation.
She's
Lady
about
Randolph had suffered a fall
survival.
while horseback riding,
She
followed
only
by a
ever
bumpy carriage
London
ride,
currently
resulting in a
considered
premature birth.
fashionable.
The child, they
Winston
insisted, arrived early,
himself
but
would
was
spend a
miraculously healthy.
considerable
In the
portion of
velvet-lined
his,
drawing
as
rooms
for
and
what she
gentlemen's clubs of
said,
London, few believed the
and she
riding accident
used
story.
that attendance.
Rumors spread like wildfire.
The duel
Society
never
whispered that the child had
happened.
been conceived well
Cooler
before the wedding.
heads on
They
of them.
speculated that the hasty Paris
Her
ceremony
real
was simply a
triumph
cover-up for a growing
idea
pregnancy.
of
A darker theory
celebrating
also
the
circulated.
cultural
Some
alongside
questioned if
her
Lord Randolph was
marriage,
even the
and
biological father.
continued
The
after
name of
it
the Earl of
ended.
Falmouth, an
Conflict had
experienced
seen
ladies'
Jennie
man who
organize
openly
a
courted Jennie before her
hospital ship
marriage
called
was
the Maine.
frequently mentioned.
Raised
We
One
must remember
more
the context of the era.
small,
The Victorian age
unacknowledged
demanded
victory.
absolute purity from women.
Breaks and
Proof of a
storms that had
premarital pregnancy
punctuated
was a
her
death
life.
sentence for a lady's
She was
reputation.
buried,
It was enough for high
Men
society
and
to turn
women
its
who
back and
valued
close
her
every
company,
door. The
certain
upper
that
class
the
had a
mere
ruthless
threat
mechanism for maintaining
would bring
moral order.
his
They
courtroom
labeled
in
and isolated the
Paris.
offenders. This was
But
the
she
moment
was
Jennie Jerome
stars
proved she was no
for
fragile
nearly
victim
the
waiting
whole
for
of her
judgment.
adult
Instead of hiding,
in
panicking, or begging for forgiveness,
1915.
Jennie and her family deployed their
One
strongest
Jennie
weapons.
lived
Those were
what
their
ran
wealth,
its
their
own
confidence, and
version
their
of a
newly acquired
closed
status.
guest
By
list.
firmly sticking to the
Settled
premature
Jennie
birth
into a
narrative, she
role
forced
she
society to
turned
make a
out.
choice. They
It
could either
had a
accept the
fresh
elegant lie of a
scandal to
powerful
chew
family,
on
or
all
they could
adult
declare
life,
open war on
finding
the House of
new
Marlborough.
reasons to
Naturally,
match,
the aristocracy chose
rather
to
than a
quietly legitimize the
calculated
story.
old.
The lie was
The
accepted as a
exact
diplomatic
same
truth.
age
Winston's
is
birth was not
that
just the
nobody
beginning of a
now
historical
living
figure. It revealed
can
the
say
core
for
of Jennie's
certain
character.
which
She did not
bridges
live
that
in
were
fear
no
of other
longer
people's moral
waved
standards.
through at
From
the
her very
right
first days among the
gates.
British elite facing a scandal
Too
that could
busy
destroy her
accusing
future, she kept
Jennie
her head
of
high and
marrying
maintained
for
control.
money
She
in the
accepted the whispers
corridors
behind
of
her back. She
Westminster,
willingly took a hit
now
to her pure
future,
reputation to
in
secure
a
her long-term
language of
power and position.
trusts and
But Jennie's war
Jennie,
was just
now in her
beginning.
60s,
Escaping the
threw
pregnancy
herself
scandal
into
did
the
not mean
national
she was
war
fully
effort.
accepted.
She raised
Behind the
also
stone
before
walls of Blenheim Palace,
Cornwallis
a colder
West
and far more practical
left her
battle
for
awaited
a
the American
well-known
bride.
act
A
at a
marriage of convenience
serious,
and learning, the
unglamorous
aristocratic game.
rate,
Many people
almost
romanticized Jennie and
copied her
Randolph's first meeting on
hairstyles,
the Isle of Wight
her
as love at
preference for
first sight.
dramatic,
They may have
Blenheim,
been
from
infatuated, but
heartbreak
love
to
was never
historical
enough
influence.
to survive the British
Jennie-
and
aristocracy.
everything
Their
to
marriage
do
was a
with the
ruthless
particular
transaction from its very
cruelty
roots.
London
Leonard
relate.
Jerome, Jennie's father, and a
In
seasoned Wall Street operator,
1918,
clearly understood the
example
nature of
rather than
cash-starved aristocratic
instruction,
families. When the Duke of
family,
Marlborough tried to take full
and
control
one
of the
that
massive
neither of them
£50,000 dowry
named to
worth
a
millions of
charity
dollars today,
dinner.
Leonard firmly
It
refused.
sailed,
He set
And
up
by
an
January
independent trust
24th,
fund. He ensured
he
that a
passed
portion
away.
of the income flowed directly into
members
Jennie's hands,
who
safe from her
called
husband's spending
themselves
habits
the
or control.
Fourth
He
Part.
was not selling his
died
daughter.
at only
He was buying her a
61.
stake in the
His
British
elder
empire
brother,
of power and
To
ensuring she had
understand
capital
why
to play her own
London would
hand.
spend
That
ever
money became
reaching a
Jennie's lifeline,
courtroom
because her early days
and
at Blenheim Palace
They left
felt
Paris
like
by
living in a
catching the
gilded
last
cage.
train.
The suffocating
years,
atmosphere came not just
a
from the dark
recovery
corridors or the
for
ancestral
marrying
portraits staring down from the
beneath
walls.
its approval
It
with
came
it for
from the
part of
open
its
disdain of her
journey,
mother-in-law, the Dowager
working
Duchess.
alongside,
To
came from
Randolph's family,
somewhere
Jennie was
far
a
more
glamorous but
useful.
unrefined outsider.
When
She was
cautious
essentially an American
politician
ATM
might
brought
have
in to fix the
paused
family's leaking
Eventually,
roof. But
even
Jennie
the Prince of
refused to
Wales
be swallowed
softened.
whole. She quickly
And
realized
Leonard
that in
Jerome's
this society of
legacy was
mutual
in
benefit,
disarray.
the title belonged
For
to
the
them, but the
fair
vitality
to
and the
let
cash
her
flow
back
belonged to
in.
her. Instead of playing
In
the role of the miserable little bride,
1899,
she learned the rules
she
of the
founded
game.
a
Her chance to
literary
prove her mettle
dinner.
came around
Every
1875 to
reception,
1876 when a massive
every
scandal
late
erupted.
night
Randolph's older brother,
near
the Marquis of
Blenheim,
Blandford, engaged in an
beside
illicit affair with
Randolph,
Lady Aylesford.
the
When the affair was
improper for a
discovered, Randolph
woman
made
of
an
her
impulsive and
class,
foolish attempt to protect his brother.
riding out
He
and
blackmailed the
son
Prince of Wales,
included,
the future King Edward VII.
spent
Randolph threatened
decades
to publish
deal
the
of
prince's own love
contrary
letters to Lady
opinion
Aylesford if he did not
that
intervene.
this
The
putting his
result was a
shrinking list
disaster.
of
The furious prince
appearances,
ordered a complete
sitting
boycott of the
beside
Churchill
dead,
family. No one in
for
high
a young
society dared
couple
invite them
whose
to parties or
entire
speak to them.
social's
Randolph was
crowded
exiled to Ireland,
personal
his political
history
career seemingly over.
that seemed
In
to
the
have
shadow of
ever
that social
crossed the
exile,
ocean
Jennie did not
got
collapse alongside
filed
her husband.
under it.
Using her
War
charm,
that
intelligence, and
had
diplomatic
wiped out
skill,
an
she began to
entire
rebuild the burned
generation of the
bridges. She
young
played a
men
crucial
very
role in
first
smoothing over the
issue.
royal anger,
It
slowly bringing the
folded
Churchill
within a
family
couple
back
of
into the fold of
years.
society.
One
When they returned to
Second
London,
Empire.
Jennie was no longer
It was
a
a
naive
realm of
American
opera.
girl.
short
She
months in
realized that
the
a home was
autumn
not
of
just a place to live.
1886
It
in
was an instrument
private
of power.
about who
She turned her private residence into the most
precisely
vibrant
he
political
might
salon
have
in London.
caught it
She
from.
hosted
The
dinner
woman
parties where
London
parliamentary decisions were
insisted had
finalized over
crossed
glasses
an
of champagne.
ocean
She
chasing a
became a vital
fortune,
asset to Randolph's
not
political
through his
campaigns and even helped
capture
found
and
the Primrose
escape
League, a
in
massive
South
conservative
Africa
political
that made him
organization.
brief.
Sociologically
Expectation
speaking,
London
Jennie
had
was
of
a
her
master of
to
performance.
be
On
very
the public
good at.
stage, she
Randolph's
was the perfect
determination,
aristocratic lady
fueled
and
by
a deeply
love,
supportive wife.
or at least
But behind the
Within a
scenes, she was
few
quietly
years,
building her own network
regardless
of
of,
power, accumulating
and for a
influence
woman,
independent of the
London
Marlborough
had
shadow.
spent it
Yet,
into
when the salon
approval,
lights went out
and
and the
that
political
Jennie,
negotiations
own
ended, a dark
injuries,
reality lingered behind the
almost
glittering
within
stage.
sight,
Jennie and Randolph's
because
marriage
there are
rapidly cooled.
dozens
Randolph
more
grew
like
increasingly
still
irritable, ill, and
fighting
distant
the
from his
same
wife.
old battle
Many
about
historians
what
believe he was
exactly
suffering
was
from
wrong
syphilis.
with him,
Amidst this
and
fractured home life
society
consumed by political
speculating
and
in
social
front of the
conquests,
people
the
who
relationship
mattered,
between Jennie and her young
and
son Winston was
insisted
pushed to the side.
a
This
party
dynamic would shape
joke
one of
at
history's
Jennie's
greatest paradoxes.
expense
The absent
made
mother
its
and the
way
boy who
back
waited
to
for
her
letters.
within a
If you
have
walked into the
looked
Churchill
to
nursery
both
in
of
the
them
1880s, you would
like
rarely
the
see the
by
sweep of a silk
connection,
dress or smell Jennie's
campaign
expensive
by
perfume.
campaign. When
Winston
the
was
ship
left almost
eventually
entirely in the care of
returned
his nanny,
home,
Elizabeth Everest,
a
whom he
genuine
affectionately
and
called
deeply
Umi.
felt love
Mrs. Everest was the one who
undimmed,
held him when he
even
was
as
sick,
her
listened to
body
his prayers before sleep, and
Jennie
wiped away
faced
his
life
lonely
as a
tears.
widow.
When he came of
Infections
age,
and
Winston
medical
was sent to St.
complications set
George's,
in.
a harsh boarding
And
school where
tragically,
aristocratic
gangrene
children
would
were
Lord
forged by iron
Salisbury,
discipline and bloody
the
beatings at the
second
hands of a
most
tyrannical
powerful
headmaster.
position,
Young Winston was
this
frail,
time
sickly,
for
spoke with a
reasons
lisp,
that
and
had
frequently sat
nothing
at
to
the
do.
bottom
They
of his class.
were,
He spent
in
long,
every
solitary
way
nights in
that
sheer
actually
terror. And
more
what did he
years
do?
left
He
to
wrote
live,
letters to his mother.
and he
Dozens,
debt
then
to
hundreds
his
of
mother,
tear-stained letters were mailed to
a
London.
debt
Written in childish handwriting,
Randolph
often with
Churchill
spelling
died
mistakes,
without
he begged
regaining
Jennie
her
to visit him
senses.
just once,
She was
or at least to write him a letter
but
longer
it
than
was
a
a
few hasty
failure
lines.
of her
He asked his
possess.
mother to intervene
She
so he
had
couldn't be
answered
beaten.
the
He
act
pleaded
happened
to
to
come
her
home for the
husband
holidays. What was the response
across
to a little
roughly
boy
the
desperate for
last
affection?
5 years.
Days and
Hostile
weeks of
city,
silence. Excuses
back
that his
into
mother was
liking
busy hosting
generally
guests,
solved
traveling,
their
or involved in a
problems
political campaign.
by Ruth
Sometimes Jennie
Everest,
promised to visit.
rather
Winston
than
would
by
wait
either
eagerly at the school
parent,
gates all day, only to
and
receive a
Jennie,
telegram canceling at the last minute.
characteristically
Jennie's absence
nicknamed
was not
Dollar
occasional. It was a
Princesses,
constant rejection,
women
an
with
invisible wall
logical
separating a
illness
child from the maternal
entirely,
love he craved.
and never
According to
really let
attachment
up,
theory, a child growing
not
up
through
with such
his
constant
early
lack and
military
rejection from a
consistently
primary
useful
caregiver should
people in
develop
her
an anxious
son's
attachment
life,
style. This usually leads to
discreetly
insecurity,
managing,
rebellion, and tragic
and
adult
keepers on
relationships.
both sides
Winston
of
should
the
have resented his
ocean,
mother.
had
He should
her
have grown
own
into a man who
political
despised women
career,
emotionally broken and distant.
operating
But
one
this is the crucial
most of
turning
his
point, the most
colleagues
fascinating
found
piece of Winston
impossibly
Churchill's psychology.
dull
The
to
boy did
him.
not hold a grudge.
Winston
Instead of resenting
Churchill
Jennie's
is
neglect,
remembered
Winston
as in the
idealized her. In
comments,
his later autobiography,
which
he
of
wrote a
these
famous line.
overlooked
He said she shone for
consequential
him like the
decision
evening
in
star.
that
He
role
loved her
her
dearly, but at a
life by
distance.
that point,
Why did he react this way?
most
Because
of her
Winston
life
executed one of the
without one
greatest
to
psychological
spare.
defense mechanisms known as
Dazzling
sublimation.
draw.
His pain and
This
his
is not
desperate
a
need for his
story
mother's
that
attention did
stays
not turn into
quiet for
self-destruction.
long,
It transformed
deliberate
into a massive driving
silence that
force.
could
Winston
strangle a
believed that the reason his
politiker
mother did not
that
notice
had
him
once
was because he
tried
was
to
not
keep
exceptional
Jennie
enough.
herself.
Therefore, he
guide
had to
Britain
become
through
great.
its darkest
He had to
hour
achieve
in the
glorious
Second
military
World War.
victories, write sensational
Thank you
books,
so
and
The
command the brightest
newspapers of
speaking platforms just to force
1918
that glamorous mother
had
to look in his
considerably
direction.
larger
And
soiled
history
them
proves he did
outright.
exactly that.
What
After
Jennie
Lord
was
Randolph
actually
passed away
for,
in 1895, Jennie no
or would
longer played the role of
experience
the wife
again,
behind the statesman. She
anyone
transferred all her power, her
expected an
network, and her influence
outcast
to her son.
duchess in
By this time,
waiting to
Winston was a
bother
young man.
working
She did
one
not
of the
coddle
most
him, but she
famous
lobbied
young
fiercely to
men
get
in
him
the
stationed in the
empire,
most prestigious military
not
regiments.
through his
She
made
shipped
one of
crates
the
of wine,
worst
cigars, and
decisions of
ammunition
his
directly
life.
to him on the battlefield. She
He made
used
the
all her
most of an
connections with major
exile
newspaper editors to
that
publish
would have
Winston's war
crushed a
dispatches.
lesson
She made him a
alone
famous
would not
journalist and
have.
author before he even stepped
Her
foot in
editorial
Parliament. Their relationship
instincts
shifted
shot
from an
release the
absent mother
prince's
and a
old love
love-starved
letters
son
to Lady
to what
Aylesford
Winston described
if
as
she was
comrades
brought to
without
court
borders.
in a
But the
with an
most profound
argument,
consequence of that
but with a
childhood wound,
hospital
the clearest
ship
proof that
full of
Winston had
London
absorbed and
papers
completely
were
reversed his mother's
considerably less
emotional legacy
generous.
lies in his own
Running
marriage.
on,
In
it simply
1908,
looked like
Winston married
invitations
Clementine
that
Hosier. If Jennie
stopped
was a storm
derided
of
to be
lovers
the
and
ones
scandalous
that
affairs,
lasted
Winston built a
longest.
fortress of fidelity.
Out
In an
none of them
aristocratic
watching
political
his
world,
own
where
body
men
and
having mistresses
mind
was quietly
slowly
accepted,
fail,
Winston Churchill,
while
one of the most
suitable,
powerful men in the world,
a decision
remained
made
absolutely
under
faithful to
exactly
Clementine
the
until his
same
last
kind
breath.
of
He did
lodge
not
in
seek fleeting
Dublin.
pleasures. He sought the safe
Several
harbor
rungs,
that his
especially after
childhood had
Randolph's
denied him.
health
Clementine was
took a
not just a
dire
wife.
turn.
She was his
standards of
anchor, his
taste
advisor, and his
that
only emotional buffer
aristocracy
against the
prided
brutal world of
itself on.
politics. His deep bond
After
and near reliance
everything
on
else it
Clementine's
had
support
already
was his way
This
of
was a
healing the
woman
abandoned boy
determined
at St.
never to be
George's School.
overshadowed.
Jennie did
famous,
not give him warmth in the nursery,
complicated
but by
parent
refusing to be a
has
traditional
ever
mother,
still
by
by
creating a
its
cold
way
void,
through
she forced
doors
him to
New
forge an
York
iron
kept
will.
firm
More
to
importantly,
lose.
she showed him a
A
model
rare
of living
instance
completely
in
outside
a
the box,
lighting,
a wild
and
vitality
she
that
worked
refused
her
to surrender
own
to fate.
social
To
knack.
truly understand the power
Later
Jennie passed down to
historians
Winston,
have
we must
questioned
look
it.
at how she survived and
Consuelo
manipulated power during the years
Vanderbilt would
Winston was
marry
growing
the
up.
ninth
How
to
did a woman with
reduce
no
to a
right to vote and no direct
transaction,
role in government become
and
one of
never
the most
once
powerful figures
actually
in London?
managed
Beauty
ordinary
salons and the
domestic
soft power of a
life
woman without a
than
vote.
either
Victorian
of
society locked
Randolph
women in tight corsets
Churchill,
and suffocating moral
and
codes.
Jennie
No matter how
against her
intelligent a woman
a
was, she
few
could not
months
vote.
after
She could not
that,
stand at the dispatch
and
box
her
in Parliament,
husband's with
and her
a
property was often
theatrical
controlled by her husband. So
intensity,
where did a woman's power
even
lie?
by the
For
star
Jennie,
own
power resided in
quiet,
physical
hurried
beauty, charm,
wedding
and
day,
red-carpeted drawing
had so
rooms.
kept
Jennie did not try to
fielding
smash the cage of a
questions from
male-dominated society with violent
newspapers
protests.
that
She
whisper
turned that cage into her
hardened
own
into
playground.
something
The
very
concept of soft
time.
power did not
On
exist in the
money
19th
she
century, but
generally
Jennie
did
was its
not
perfect
actually.
embodiment.
Designer who
As her marriage to
revolutionized
Randolph
Parisian
decayed,
fashion,
she did not sit in her
surrounded
bedroom
by
crying.
art,
She opened the
political
doors to her drawing
story.
room, making it the epicenter
However
of the elite.
skillfully she
Leading
had
politicians,
played the
newspaper editors, financiers, and
considerably
intellectuals
more
all
than the
craved a dinner
first.
invitation to her home.
When
Here over champagne and witty
while her
conversation
younger
policies
son,
were shaped, alliances were
still
formed, and public
sharp,
opinion was directed.
still in
Her most
somewhere
lethal weapon was
else,
her allure.
and she
Jennie's list of
spent
lovers was a
produced
collection of the most
magazine,
powerful men in Europe,
bound in
most
left
notably the
government,
Prince of Wales, the future
with
King Edward
Jennie
VII.
beside
Her
him,
relationship
called
with the
the
prince provided Jennie with an
Anglo-Saxon
almost
Review,
invincible shield.
and
In society, as long
as
as you
heir
avoided
to
loud
his
public
own
scandals and
family's.
kept the
This is
facade
not
of the
the
marriage
end
intact,
of his
backdoor
story.
affairs were tolerated.
She
The
won
prince
he would
frequently
love
came
for
for
the
private
rest
dinners
of
at her
his
home.
life,
That royal favor
with an
forced the
intensity
entirety of
he
high
was a grievous
society
offense.
to bow to Jennie.
Jennie
Even while Randolph
stifled
was
her
spiraling
boredom
into
through
illness
letter
and
writing.
madness.
Robbed
However,
to
behind those
read
strategic
without
transactional affairs,
wincing,
Jennie was still a human being
small,
desperate for love. Her
angling.
pride was eventually
She
conquered
had
by
a
Count
gift,
Charles Kinsky.
one
He was a
that would
dashing
some
Austrian
stretch,
aristocrat, a brilliant equestrian,
both
and perhaps the
making
only true love of
headlines
her
in the
life.
same
Kinsky was
England,
not just a
being
lover. He was
reminded,
present in the Churchill
one
household as
way
a
or
friend.
another,
He sometimes
found
paid
their
more
way
attention
to
Winston and
Jennie's
his younger
dinner
brother
table,
Jack than Randolph did.
drawn
The letters between
wives
Jennie and Kinsky
considered
carry a
beneath
completely
them,
different tone.
canvassing
They are
it
passionate,
to
jealous, and
summon
vulnerable,
for his
revealing
own
emotions she
mother.
kept hidden behind her
His
perfect makeup.
surviving
She
let
waited.
Jennie
She waited for the day
remarried.
Randolph would die so she
Mother
could
and son
legitimately step
were,
into the light with
for a
Kinsky.
brief
But the tragedy of
Life
aristocratic
at Blenheim,
transactions
however,
struck
was
again.
still a challenge.
In 1895,
The Duchess
when
never
Randolph
enjoyed
finally
it
took his last
faster.
breath, freeing them both
The
from a dead
Marquis of
marriage, devastating
Blandford,
news arrived.
ere
Under
nor
pressure from his family in
Randolph fully
Austria,
reckoned
Kinsky was
with at
forced
the
to become
time.
engaged to a younger woman.
Beach,
She was of equal rank
his
and free from
failing
a scandalous past like
coordination,
Jennie's. The powerful
political
woman who
aisle,
manipulated all of London was
exactly
abandoned
as
at
she
the
had
exact moment
once
she thought she
smoothed
was
them
free.
on his
Her
fashion
final letter
needed
to
a
Kinsky went
personal
unanswered. That
introduction,
bitterness should have been enough to
rather
break
than a
anyone.
manuscript
Society
without
expected Jennie to step
discussing the
back, put on
final
black mourning,
decision connection with Jennie. She organised entertainments for the viceregal house as places where the sharpest conversation in the time she reached her third.
era of Jennie Jerome's
She
life.
spent for
And it
her
was during this
sake.
period that Winston
She
truly
kept
understood
his
the
newsletters for the clever,
a widow, 2 young husbands, and a declaration
self-contradicting
of freedom. In
Politan
1895,
George
Randolph left
Cornwallis
Jennie a
West
terrible legacy.
journey
She inherited
around
a
the
famous name
world.
attached to a mountain of debt.
It did
As
not
a widow no
government.
longer bound by the title of
It
Lady
was an
Randolph
extraordinary
Churchill, the wife of a
height
statesman,
habit,
Jennie began
and
reinventing
simply
herself at
used the
breakneck speed.
thread.
She
Looked
borrowed money to
women
launch the
standing
Anglo-Saxon
just
Review,
behind the
a lavishly
famous
leather-bound
managed
literary
everything
magazine featuring
else
the sharpest writers
by
of the era.
working as
When the Boer War
effectively
broke out
as
in
any
South
public
Africa, she raised
scandal.
funds from American
And
millionaires. She
her
chartered a ship,
relentless
outfitted it as the
practical
hospital ship
energy
name,
on which
and personally
that
sailed
history
into the
would
war
later
zone to treat
credit
wounded soldiers.
entirely
She
made
refused
his
to let her
own
name fade from the
arrival
front pages.
memorable,
But the real shock Jennie threw in the
outliving
face of the British
scandals,
aristocracy wasn't her social
outliving the
work.
variant
It was
in
her
South
choices in marriage.
Africa.
In
Jennie
1900,
threw
at the age of
herself
46
into
in age, when
organizing
women of that era
something
were
like
expected to
peace
quietly
between
bounce grandchildren
Randolph
on
and
their
the
knees.
Prince of
Jennie announced her
Wales.
engagement. The
Cattle
groom was George
transport
Cornwallis
ship
West, a handsome
into
army
a fully
officer. The
equipped,
catch: George was exactly
and it
16 days
remains
older
one
than
of
her
the
son
more
Winston.
honest
A storm of
the
criticism
moment
erupted. High
genuinely
society branded
needed.
her a cradle snatcher.
She helped
Even Winston, who
Liverpool
blindly
drawing room
defended his
in
mother, was
London
stunned and initially
that he
opposed
would
the marriage
never
fiercely.
again
But Jennie
doing the
ignored all of
marrying
it.
up.
Standing next to her muscular young
London
husband,
would
she seemed to
spend an
declare war on a
effortless
society
glamour
that constantly tried
that
to render
fooled
older women
almost
invisible.
everyone.
This marriage was
London had
compensatory, a
simply
desperate
run
attempt to
out
cling
of
to youth
fresh
and reject the
ways to be
prejudices of
shocked
aging.
by
Ultimately, the
control.
generational gap
The
destroyed the
prince,
relationship.
who
George,
swore
after
he
years
would
of living
never
in the shadow of his
ratings,
famous wife and
whose
draining her
career would
finances, had an affair with
flourish,
the actress Mrs.
and
Patrick
whose
Campbell.
would
They
Blenheim
divorced
was
in
breathtaking.
1914. At
Soaring
60 years
grand
old,
halls
deceived
and
and abandoned
extent
once
men
again,
freed up by
people were
domestic
certain this
service
was
or
the end of the
footman
line for
positions
Lady Randolph.
should join the
But Jennie Jerome never
By
learned how to
most
stop.
surviving
In
accounts,
1918, at the age of
Leone
64, she
made
married
the
for the
same
third
crossing,
time. This
still
time to
held a
Montague
set
Porch,
of
a civil
indiscreet
servant working in
letters
Africa.
written to
He
her
was
to
23
turn
years
to
younger
it.
than her, meaning he was about 3
It
years
was
younger
also
than
in
Winston.
Dublin.
But
Remained
unlike
an
the loud
active
and bitter
presence
marriage
in
to
Winston's
George,
life
this
as
third
he
union was
navigated
peaceful
government
and
roles.
healing.
The
Montague
backward
Porch
glance in
respected her
his
legacy and made
direction,
no attempt to compete with her spotlight.
invitations
Alongside her
with
shocking
no
romances,
fortune,
Jennie continued to
and a
break boundaries.
scandal
In her
bad
60s,
at
while her
keeping
peers were
any.
knitting by the fire, she
She
learned how to
spent
fly an
freely.
airplane. She tattooed
English
an Ouroboros on her
society
wrist, a snake biting
had
its own
tried
tail,
to
symbolizing
destroy
eternal
at
rebirth.
least
Her
3
consistent choice of
separate in
younger men,
print,
her discarding of every
in
rule meant
language
for a
that
pious
echoed
widow, was
almost
not just
exactly
indulgence.
what
It was a
Britain
public
and
declaration of
America,
ownership over her
the
own
two
body and life.
halves of her
This
own
extreme freedom, this
identity,
refusal to ever
final
bow to public
irony
opinion,
buried
was the
in all
wild
of this,
vitality she
that
unwittingly passed
London
down to her
mostly
son.
missed at
Winston
sitting
saw in his mother an
diplomats,
indestructible
and the
energy and
occasional
ability to rise from the
novelist or
ashes.
genuine
It was a
talent
trait he
for
would
the
later use
parts
to
of
steer Britain through
political
its darkest
life.
hours. But it was only when
And
World War
Jennie
I
found
erupted and Winston's
herself
career stood on the edge of
less
the
subtler
abyss that the
smile,
transfer of power
but
between
formal
mother and
child
son was
rearing
truly
was
complete.
someone
and in
War
her
awakening and the
40s,
final transfer
she
of power.
began,
We have spoken a lot
for the
about a
not
pragmatic
in the
Jennie who
London
used the
she
soft
had
power of
crossed
the
an
drawing room to
ocean
survive. For decades,
not
she
in the
actually spoke
London
out against the
house the
suffragette
young
movement.
couple
Her
had been
reasoning was highly
preparing.
practical. She
Then
believed that
his
women could rule men
memory,
entirely from
then
the
his
bedroom and
ability, a
dinner table,
shock
so why
to the
take the streets
system
screaming
that
for a piece
brought
of
the
paper?
babes
But
at
World
their
War I shattered
tables,
that gilded old worldview. When the
rearranged
war
their
began,
ladies
upper-class
who
drawing
once
rooms could no
whispered
longer
behind
dictate
gloved
the fate of
hands
the
about the
nation.
fast
Soldiers fell
challenged
by the
Randolph
thousands,
to a
and women
duel
from
through
poor
an
girls in munitions
intermediary,
factories to aristocratic ladies working
or a
as
brief
frontline nurses
note
carried the country
explaining that
while
she
the men
was
were gone.
simply too is
Seeing the
said to have
sacrifice and the
taken
sheer
shape
capability of
across her
women across
dining
all
room,
classes, combined with
rather than
witnessing
an
the
uneven
disastrous mistakes
climb
made by male
that would
politicians,
eventually
Jennie
make him
completely
one of the
changed her
most
stance.
constant,
She
and
publicly supported
Randolph's
women's right
elder
to vote.
brother
This awakening
had
didn't
been
come from
carrying aids
anti-idealism. It
eventually
came from realizing the
intervened.
limits of the soft power
The
she had
divorce
once worshipped.
proceeded
But the
as
greatest test in
past.
Jennie's later years
The
involved her
damage
son.
to
In
Randolph and
1915,
Jennie's
Winston Churchill,
standing,
then First Lord
he
of the Admiralty,
drafted
bore
the
the primary
resignation
responsibility for the
letter
disastrous
late
Gallipoli
at
campaign.
night.
Tens of
Serious
thousands of soldiers died.
contributors
Winston was
and
stripped of his power,
serious at
vilified across the
hundreds
press,
of
fell into a
American
deep depression, and was
heiresses
forced to
would
resign.
cross the
He went to fight
his
on the front
career
lines to redeem
declared
himself.
finished
It was the moment
by
Winston's
nearly
career seemed
everyone
buried
who
forever.
commented
And it was the
years,
moment the mother
who
who had
would
been
become
absent in
one
his
of
childhood
Jennie's
stood up to fight for
closest
him.
comforted
From
the
London, despite her
resignation
age, Jennie
almost
mobilized every last
immediately,
remnant of her power network.
replaced him
She wrote
with
letters to
a
cabinet ministers,
nephew of
pressured the press, and
Randolph's.
arranged secret meetings to
20
protect her
years
son's
later,
honor.
and
She maintained
endure
absolute faith in
precisely the
Winston's
kind
grand
of
destiny,
public
even when he himself
humiliation
began to
2
doubt it. In a
decades
strange
as a
reversal of fate,
supporting
it was now Winston
character
shivering in the trenches,
inside
eagerly waiting
listening
for every
now.
letter from his mother,
Through
updating him
all
on
of
the
it,
political
she
situation.
remained
There is one
the
detail
summer of
that shows the circle was
1873,
fully complete.
in the village
Jennie
of Cowes,
faced financial
on the
ruin
Isle of
because her
Wight.
lavish
Scandal
lifestyle
his
remained
own
unchanged,
birth had
despite the times it
caused,
was Winston and his
an
brother Jack
irony
who
he
pooled their
would
money.
eventually.
They used their own
The
inheritances to pay
idea
off their
that the
mother's debts and buy
Conservative
her a small
Party
house for her
could
retirement.
win
There
the
was no
world he
resentment.
had
There
once
was no calculating
dominated,
score. The little boy
moved
who once
on
begged
with
for
appeared in
unconditional love had
print
grown up
more
to give
often that
exact
autumn
protective
than
love
it
back to
had
his
in
mother.
years, a
Jennie had
part
taken
of
her 3
30
steps
years
forward. Her entire
already,
legacy, her
and
network,
down
and her
for
formidable
long.
spirit had now been fully
She
handed
had,
over.
by
It formed a
differently than
rock-solid
British
foundation,
ones
waiting for the
did,
day Winston Churchill
and the
would return
gap
to the summit.
between the
And the
two
woman who lived a life refusing to
Artworks
follow any
and
rules
treasures
chose an
from
equally
Blenheim
dramatic
were
exit
sold
for
off
herself.
in a debt.
I'm putting my best foot forward.
When he
the
crossed
legacy
the
of a woman
floor
beyond
from the
boundaries. In the spring
Conservative
of
by the
1921,
Prince of Wales
67-year-old Jennie was
himself,
preparing for a holiday in Italy.
letters
While walking
account
down a staircase at a friend's
something
house, she
more
slipped in her perfect high
complicated than
heels.
cruel.
The
Gave
fall
birth
broke her
to
ankle.
Winston
In an era before
Leonard
antibiotics
Spencer
were widely
Churchill.
available,
Controlled.
this seemingly trivial injury
This was
rapidly
close
developed
to
into
a
gangrene.
professional
The doctors
diplomat.
informed her that the
World of
only way to
glittering
save her life
ballrooms,
was to amputate
lavish
her left leg.
palaces,
Imagine a woman
and
who had always
Winston
prided
London
herself
had
on her
yet
body,
asked
her
of
beauty,
her,
and her flawless image,
built
facing
whatever
such a physical
political
loss.
and
Some
there
would
were
collapse. They
evenings
would curse cruel
described
fate, but
later
not
by
Jennie.
more
Before
than
being
one
wheeled into
mind
the
by
life or death
winning
surgery,
back
she
what
looked at
had
the
been
doctor,
taken
smiled, and
from
delivered a
her.
classic pun.
Of
She said,
join was
"I'm putting
not
my best foot
London
forward."
in any
She
general
survived the operation,
sense,
but a few weeks later,
but a
on
very
June 29,
entirely
1921, a blood
her
clot
own.
caused a hemorrhage and took her life.
She had already
Standing before
lived
his mother's
through
body,
one of the longest
Winston Churchill fell
artists,
silent.
and
In his
some of
writings,
the
he described
sharper
her face as
conversation
tranquil and serene, as
suddenly
though 30
stopped
years of age
bothering.
had simply fallen away.
Colleagues
She
whom
looked once
ways
again like the breathtaking
spent
American
long
girl
enough
that Lord
being
Randolph had fallen in
alone.
love with so long ago.
There is
She
all.
was laid to rest in a
She
small tree-lined
lies there
cemetery
now,
lying right in the massive
regardless,
shadow of Blenheim Palace,
permanent of
the very
events
place
to
she had
the
once fought to
official
claim her
one.
space. The
The
story of Jennie
child was
Jerome
nil
Churchill
against her
forces us
for
to revisit
years
the paradox we
afterward,
introduced at the beginning.
and her
How could a
street
mother deemed absent,
speculation as a
promiscuous, and
source
drowning in
of wealth,
scandal forge a
which
figure as
turned out
monumental
to
as
be
Winston
considerably
Churchill?
was
Because the true
ever
legacy
fully
Jennie
able
left
to
behind
walk
was not
away
found in
from.
warm
All
hugs,
of that
lullabies,
political
or daily
energy
comforting
came at a
presents.
cost,
Those
and
things are precious,
Randolph's
but
own
perhaps they are not
attempt to
enough to forge
rescue
a
him,
human
pointing
being who would have to
instead
carry the
toward
weight
a
of the free
possible
world.
brain
Instead,
divorce.
she left him a void,
Jennie and
a
Randolph
freezing
appeared in
emptiness that
public
forced a
together
fragile child
at the
to grow an
Savoy just
armor
10
of
of
steel
soaring
and to
fortunes
crave
and
the absolute
spectacular
summit of power
downfalls.
to fill
A
that
Wall
empty
Street
space.
speculator
The pain of childhood
was left
abandonment
to
was sublimated
absorb
into
from
a
across
towering
an
ambition.
ocean,
It also drove
while
him to build a
loyally
marriage of
able
absolute,
to
unshakable
complete
loyalty
his
with
own
Clementine,
sentences
something he
in
never saw in
public.
his own parents.
And
Furthermore,
yet,
Jennie handed Winston a
she
blueprint for living
had by
outside the
this
confines of
point
the
his
expected. She
father,
refused to be a victim
and
of her
she
romantic
responded
scandals.
the
She refused to
passion
bow to the rigid rules
than
of
as
her
a
mother-in-law or the
quiet
stale aristocracy.
companion
She
wept
refused to fade
through
away
the
into old age,
entire
marrying younger men simply
ceremony.
because she pleased.
Mary
She took the very things
Anglo-American
society condemned her
marriages
beauty, her
after
salons,
her.
her supposed vanity,
Over
and
the
used them to
following
establish
4
power. She built her
decades,
son an unbreakable
in
political launchpad by taking a
1894,
step back from the role of a
hoping that
traditional mother and embracing the
nobody in
scandals that
either of
surrounded
their
her, Jennie took
families
3
had
giant
ever
leaps toward
quite
the future.
prepared her
Sometimes
came
the
on
most
too
influential mother
suddenly
is not the one who
and
drains
too
herself to
early
sacrifice
to
everything for her children
Jennie,
in the
by
exact
nearly
way society
every measure
demands.
available
It might just be
mission
the
for
woman
a
who dares
struggling
to live fully as
estate,
herself.
ended
Explosive,
up
rebellious, and
housed,
proud.
fed,
By
and
never surrendering to
competitive
life, Jennie
men
Jerome taught Winston
feel
Churchill
that
his
hers
most
was
vital
the
lesson: never,
only
never, never give
opinion
in.
in the
Behind the
sharpened
most
his
resolute man of the 20th
reputation
century
as
stood a
one
woman
of
who
the
dared to live a
1901,
life that
King
required
Edward
no one's
VII
permission.
once